When I was going through my rehabilitation for my brain injury, if it wasn't for the testosterone, I wouldn't have gotten through it. TRT doesn't make you want to go to the gym. It doesn't take you to the gym, but it makes you more inclined to go if you understand, because you actually want to now train and move and so on and so forth, because you now have this physiological energy that you're basically wanting to push your body.
You're in the Wikipedia files now. So what I mean by that is Dave Lee is in there as an inventor of something that someone hadn't done before. You've kind of put your brick in the road. And I would say, I mean, there's various things you've done, but for me, I know Australia specific, within Australia, you changed the course of the way that struggling men in Australia got very needed scripts, because you were a solution to a problem that needed to be fixed. I mean, no one here that's not Australian doesn't understand how difficult it was until you came across Dave Lee.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two is that there were obviously doctors doing it before. It's just they weren't helpful. So you not only got the script and helped.
Yeah. That was a big thing that I felt driven to, because when I was going through my rehabilitation for my brain injury, if it wasn't for the testosterone, I wouldn't have gotten through it, because that was just this insurmountable, horrific period of what I would call living hell. And testosterone didn't make it less hell, but it kind of gave me like a sword that I could pick up to fight back. And that allowed me to progress with intensity and resilience that I didn't ever think that I would be capable of. And that was a really cool thing to be able to do, because when I got through it, I was like, I'm the guy who got through that. And like, when I tell my story of what I went through in that, it still doesn't seem real that I actually did that. And for people who've been through traumatic events and periods of your life, your memory kind of blocks out a lot of it to kind of, it's patchy. But the stuff that I do remember is something that I would like when I was doing the rehab that I was doing. And for those who don't know, I had very severe vestibular neuritis. So it was like if we spun around on those stools over there 50 times, and it was like that for years. So, I went from running this digital marketing thing I was doing before. I was in a band, really enjoying my life. Fast forward 2 years, every doctor told me at first that it would go back to normal. It didn't. And then when they eventually diagnosed the nerve issue, they said that the damage is too severe. This is never going to get better. And, multiple, many nights of inconsolable crying with my mum sitting on the end of my bed. Later, I basically realized that I was in a situation where I couldn't continue with the way that I was feeling, but I didn't have the balls to kill myself. And I was like, there's only one way out of that, which is that you have to fix the problem, because both of them were not consequences that I literally couldn't do either of them. Maybe if I'd had a gun, pulling the trigger would have been doable, but taking your life without an automatic weapon is not an easy thing to do.
Yep. It's not.
No. So when I was at that point, it was probably 8 to 10 hours a day once I eventually found a vestibular rehab specialist. Her name was Kate at the Perth Dizziness Balance Clinic. When I went to see her, she was like, you might be able to create some compensation if you work really hard on this, that you can live a functional life. And I was like, if I can just get to the point that I can not be a financial burden on my mum, then that's okay. So, I'm like, I have an undergrad degree in marketing. I can get like a, $50K a year office job. If I can, learn to be able to read a screen properly again, I'm like, cool. Like I'll fight to do that. And to be very, very honest, and I've said this a couple of times before, is that I didn't think I was going to get better. I just wanted to leave a story that when I did eventually off myself, that at least at my funeral, people respected my memory, to be like, that dude went down swinging. That's all I wanted. And then there was a point where I went to I did a very strong macro dose of psilocybin mushrooms in a therapeutic context. So legal country in Europe, guided therapy session with what would be deemed a heroic dose of psilocybin. And on the way to the ceremony on the flight, I couldn't watch movies properly, but because the plane screen was so small, I could, because I didn't have to move my eyes very far. So I'm like, oh, I can watch movies. I've been really wanting to watch Skyscraper with Dwayne Johnson in it. Mm-hmm. And I love those old Dwayne Johnson movies because he's basically like a pseudo superhero because he's like a big black Samoan. Yeah. Like, it's just, they're all the same, but I love them. And I was watching this movie and, you know, it didn't, when you use psychedelics, one thing I learned down the line is that your set and setting is really important. And we often talk about the diet, but there's also the diet of what you consume impacts, you know, your experience. So because I'd watched that movie the day before, it was very fresh in my unconscious. And there was this point where I kind of rose out of my body and I looked down at myself, and it was, you know, I was communicating with what people would call like the higher consciousness. And the only message I had for myself was that if you call it quits now, Dwayne Johnson would never play you in a movie. And I was like, that stung. And I just started testosterone like a couple of weeks before that. And that having the someone say, you can do this with some rehab, you might be able to get your life back. And then to have that kind of tough love for myself. And then I came back and I was like, I'm going to do this. And I remember listening to the first David Goggins podcast on Joe Rogan, where he basically tells like the summary version of his book. I probably listened to that podcast 100, 200 times. Just, I would go down to one of the ovals in Perth, like the football ovals, and I would do the rehab exercises that I was meant to do for half an hour a day for 8 hours. I would just do them over and over and over again. And it progressed from like, you know, you would focus on a dot on the wall and just like look, like you'd maintain your eye contact. And then there was like another one that I had to do at home, which is like you're in a corridor and you have to walk in a straight line moving your head. And eventually over many months it progressed to like, you know, running backwards or like running forward with your eyes closed and doing a 360 spin. And I would be vomiting multiple times from the dizziness and falling over all the time. And I would just be like, a lot of the time I'd just play the Rocky music just over and over again. And just, I would just put myself into this like masochistic trance of being like, there's no other path forward. I want to be the guy who did this. And I was such a little bitch before that. Like, I mean, I was the opposite of anyone who would have anything close to those traits, like that could even have been possible. Like I even telling it now, it doesn't really seem like I would have been the person who could have done that. But when you're in a state of desperation and there's no other choice, that's what I had to do. And if it wasn't for the testosterone, I wouldn't have wanted to do it, to even try, but two, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And when something like that had such a profound impact that when I got out the other end, because at the end of it, I went back to university, I did a diploma in science once I could kind of read a little bit better. Wanted to do a master's in neuropsychiatry, but dropped out of that because it was all bullshit. But I learned that I was like, hang on, this hormone is actually really important for the brain. What about things like pregnenolone, DHEA, melatonin? And then I got into peptides. So I used PPC back in like 2016 when it was 2017, when it was very novel. And I just basically one day at the end of this rehab process, I was like, I'm just going to do a Hail Mary. I'm just going to get every possible supplement that is good for the brain. I'm going to stack them all together. I'm going to stack it with the BPC. I'm going to do everything all at once. And I'm going to go as much in on this rehab as possible while using this peptide and see how far I can get. And I got to this point. I was at a friend's, because things had gradually gotten better over this point, not to the point that it was amazing, but gotten better. And I went to a friend's property who was on an orchard. And I remember we went through a walk through the orchard and someone called out and I looked over my shoulder and I realized that I wasn't off balance. And I realized I hadn't been off balance for a few weeks or maybe a month. And I was like, I think I just burst out crying. I was like, this is like, it's over. It's done. And after that point, I was working like 3 days a week for a not-for-profit minimum wage job, just being able to fuel my car. I was still living with my mom and, just going to the gym twice a day, doing the rehab and kind of gotten out of the tail end. And I was like, this helping guys with TRT who were going through their version of this hell period in their life, this is like the only thing that matters. Like everything else is just a fucking waste of time. So I started doing it on the side. while I was still working. And then eventually it transitioned into my calendar was booked out, and I was like, I'm going to do this full time, and took the plunge on it. And I've just been helping with all I've done over the last 5 years is done consults to help guys with their TRT. And then if someone sent me an email and gave me an opportunity, I just said yes. And then I worked out how I could make it work later, which included like all-nighters and weekends and whatever. I just said yes to every opportunity that popped up in my inbox, and I helped everyone that I possibly could.
If you've just started TRT, it is completely normal to feel overwhelmed and confused. There's a lot of new territory to cover, and there is a lot of conflicting information. I wrote TRT 101 so that you can have everything that you need to know in an instruction manual in one place that you can refer back to, that you can have all the questions answered before they even come up. TRT 101 is my best practice approach for TRT from start to finish, and it contains everything that you need to avoid all the challenges and pitfalls that I've seen come up in my clients over the last 5 years. You can check it out via the link below.
For you with this, we'll call it a trauma.
Yep.
I still don't really know how to define that word, a trauma. And I think about it myself. I'm not really comfortable talking about things on camera from my past. Not that like I'm insecure about it. It's just coming from this commando approach. It's got to be something from my father and his father's father, you know? We just don't talk about things.
Yeah.
It's just like how it is. But I'm lucky in the sense that I have a terrible memory. Like I've been told by friends, bro, how can you not remember that? And I'm like, I don't know, maybe it's the drugs. That's been a blessing for me because I can sort of remember these traumas, but I don't feel them.
Yeah.
I see a lot of guys that talk about things that have happened 5-10 years ago. I would even argue less severe than what happened to me, but they are still hyper emotional about it. Now, how much of that, this is the question, has got to do with the fact that they may have low testosterone levels? Some of these males in question, I know they do, because obviously living in this modern environment, quite a lot of people, even more than 50% do these days, right? How much of that has got to do with the fact that I had always had optimized testosterone levels? So I've always got this ambition, I'll beat it mindset, just naturally without having to amp myself up. How much of that can be helped for these men by just simply optimizing testosterone levels? If they did nothing else at all, they just optimized testosterone levels, how much of an impact will that have on their behavior?
A big impact. This is the whole nature versus nurture thing in a different context. And I think there's a few layers to it. I think that the challenge is that if you've had low testosterone during your formative years and then you correct it, then you have to relearn a lot of stuff. And that's why I often say to guys that it takes, TRT takes time to work, but it also takes time to do the work. And you have to basically recreate yourself through habits and action and programmed adversity and giving it time to change who you are. And I just go, look, puberty took about 5 years to do that, so it's probably about the same. And that tends to be the timeline. But I also think that, and this is again the nature versus nurture thing, because your biology impacts your actions to some degree. It changes your disposition towards things. TRT doesn't make you want to go to the gym. It doesn't take you to the gym, but it makes you more inclined to go if you understand, because you actually want to now train and move and so on and so forth, because you now have this physiological energy that you're basically wanting to push your body. So when it comes to growing up with more optimal testosterone levels and having optimal testosterone levels for a prolonged period, you're probably more likely to take actions and do things that involve you becoming exposed to some degree of stress. Whereas people who are low testosterone tend to, by default, gravitate more towards avoidant behaviors. And this is because testosterone is an internal biological buffer towards stress. So DHT in particular, and testosterone as well, has an internal antagonistic action with cortisol at the receptor level. So if you have something that increases dopamine transmission and reduces cortisol activation, you're basically going to be in situations where stresses don't feel as paralyzing and debilitating, and there's more reward that comes from taking risks. Now, this can also lead people down bad paths, because it can make you more predisposed to doing stupid, reckless shit and getting hurt or getting into gambling and drugs and everything else.
That's for sure.
Yeah. But you can also, and that's why sometimes it's a blessing that we optimize testosterone levels once emotional maturity is set in, which is also good. But the challenge with going through like a trauma, if we're going to use the T word, is that the brain perceives stress subjectively. So if someone's never been through anything remotely difficult, and then they go through something like, I don't know, year 12 TE exams at the end of high school, that could induce PTSD in someone who's a complete snowflake because they've never been through anything remotely difficult, and now they've got high parental expectations or high self expectations, and people have had fucking meltdowns when I was in school over that.
I remember.
Yeah. And it's because that's the most difficult thing they'd ever gone through. So internally, that stress response would be the same as if, multiple guys with axes came in and tried to kill us now. Like, it would be the same internal cascade of stress because the baseline for what is stressful and what is easy is subjective. And that's why I think it's so important that people go through some kind of rite of passage. And I hadn't been through a rite of passage before, and then I got hit with like the Godzilla of them, which was very difficult, but it also, I'm grateful that I came out the other side. But it's when it also comes to stress, and I can speak about PTSD because I went through something that was so stressful. I believe that when we're looking at PTSD, it's because the trauma hasn't been integrated properly. So if people go through something really difficult and really challenging, and then they don't integrate it positively into learning from it or growing from it or understanding it, then it can really eat away at them and build up over time and become something that completely derails and destroys their entire life because they haven't moved on from it. And I think the only way that you can move on from a trauma is find a way to integrate it, that you can grow from it, you can learn from it, you can have it serve you. And that can be really difficult when it's something horrific and it's something acute and it's something that you're like a victim of, a random act of violence or something like that. But one of the things that we used to talk about at the gym I used to work at, and this was right after I finished university, my first job was at a terrible gym in Perth. And we did like some very beginner level martial arts classes, like boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, BJJ. And one thing that the instructor spoke to me about, who was a fantastic instructor, and I was like, because I was doing sales in the gym, and I was like, who should I recommend what class for? I didn't know anything about martial arts, never watched an MMA fight, didn't know anything about any of this. And he was like, recommend that the women do BJJ. And I was like, why? And he's like, a lot of women in Perth have unfortunately been sexually assaulted to some degree, whether it's a situation that they didn't really want to be in and went along with, or full-blown sexual assault. And he goes, there is nothing more beneficial for a woman who has been sexually assaulted than to learn how to absolutely fucking murder someone who is bigger than them, heavier than them, and on top of them. And he's like, this is the ultimate subjective experiential therapy for people who've been through a trauma where they felt physically violated by someone bigger than them, because they're getting back into that compromised position and they're learning how to strategically take action and become dominant in that position. And I was like, that makes sense.
Daily injections are ideal because this gives you ultra stable testosterone levels. If you can really frequently administer something with a very long half-life, you can keep your levels super, super stable. And I think that this is the most beneficial way to do TRT. However, how should TRT be administered?